Greetings and welcome everyone to this week's episode of Poly Weekly News. I'm your host David Danto, and look, we're here. We're at the NAB 2022 convention. I've been coming to the National Association of Broadcasters conventions probably since the late 1980s, so that's how old I am. You can see the gray. But it's interesting how this show has morphed. I did a lot of learning and teaching of video production many years ago and understanding what production rules are. And for the most part, most of that knowledge is now useless because we have it built into our cameras. Take a look at this clip and you'll see what I mean.
Why do we insist on wide angles for video conferencing? Because after we add more people,
you need a wide shot to see all of us.
But this isn't a good experience for our coworkers. We feel so far away.
DirectorAI technology, an intelligent camera framing system that automatically follows the conversation. DirectorAI goes to a tight shot when someone is talking.
And gently zooms out to include someone chiming in nearby.
DirectorAI dissolves to someone talking on the other side of the room.
Or creates a split screen.
When two people are going back and forth.
So now everyone has the same personal meeting experience, whether they're in the room or remote.
The next evolution of conversation, DirectorAI technology.
So that's some pretty awesome capabilities, all built into a box. I don't want to explain the details of it to you, but my friend and colleague Andie Mace is here, and she's going to give you the details of why we do it and how we do it, and show you some of the background behind it. Take it away, Andie.
All right, thank you, David, for passing it over to me for that introduction. And I am really excited to talk to everyone today about our smart camera technology, which we call DirectorAI. And talking about the science of DirectorAI, but also something that is a little bit less known, which is the art of DirectorAI. And I think that is a really special thing that our team is able to give to you. So super excited to talk about that with you today. So first of all, before I even jump into the meat of this deck, I want to run through what meetings look like today, because I think that's a very important element of why DirectorAI is so important. So meetings in 2022, right, they are hybrid. And by hybrid, I mean they've got a mixture of people who are calling from the office together, people who are calling from the office alone, people who are calling remotely from all over the world. And that makes this a really unique challenge to have a meeting. So really, we dealt with remote video calls throughout all of the pandemic, and sometimes it was a little bit subpar because we were just settling into this new experience. And even if you'd video conferenced before, it just felt different when you were forced to do it at home every day of the week. So really, we've gotten to a point in this hybrid world that we're not settling for any more subpar video experiences, because we've already done that for a fair part of the pandemic. And we're now recognizing, that this experience is here to stay. We've talked to a lot of customers, and our customers are saying that their workforce is distributed, right? So they've got half of people who want to come back into the office and half the people who want to stay fully remote. And of those coming into the office, half of those want to do hybrid, so a few days in, a few days out. So this is not going away, and we can't settle for those subpar experiences anymore. But as we are figuring this out together, right, we have recognized some inequalities between in-person and remote workers in terms of kind of like not really, I guess, the experience, but more of the opportunities that there are for success and to be present and to speak. And that's obviously a huge problem, especially if we want to be successful in hybrid work and if we want this to be our future. And then we've also seen that a lot of people have begun to search for a fix to that issue of inequality. And, I don't think any of us have a full answer yet, but we're definitely looking for that. So exciting times. Some other specific challenges that we're seeing in the hybrid world, according to our own research, according to some of our analysts, we're seeing a little bit of a loss of productivity. And not necessarily everyone is experiencing this, but it's definitely a challenge that we are expecting to combat, right? As we spend more time fully remote or fully hybrid, there could be some loss of productivity. We're also seeing a bit of instances of remote workers having a bit less visibility as compared to their in-person counterparts. And when I say less visibility, what I mean is less visibility by coworkers. Coworkers might be in the office hanging out together, working on projects together. And if you're remote, you don't have that visibility from them, but also into what they're doing. You don't have the opportunities necessarily to walk past your manager in the office and have those impromptu conversations. And you have less visibility, as I said, into what your team is doing in the office. So if you have a half remote team and half is hybrid or in office, you have to work a lot harder to have that visibility into what they're doing. And that is a challenge, to work harder and make sure that remote workers are included. And with all of these things happening, we might also see a bit of lower employee engagement. So that's also a challenge that we're going to try and combat. But as you've got a little bit less productivity, you don't feel like you're as visible. It's kind of a natural progression that you would feel a bit less engaged at work. And maybe you don't feel this initially, but it's possible that it could happen over time if there isn't a solution to the problems that we are experiencing in the hybrid working world. I know that I personally have experienced this a bit, the challenge of working remote during the pandemic when I was fully remote, and then I felt that it got a bit better when I was kind of coming into the office a few days, and I'm fully remote again because I've moved across the country. So I'm fully remote on my own choice. But there are challenges that I'm facing now, and it makes it a bit harder to be productive and to feel really engaged unless I'm actively working to combat those challenges. And then another challenge that we're going to see, and we have started to see, is the challenge of building that trust and community between remote and in-person workers. And I think this is a really key element of this whole story, right? So it's a challenge, yes, but I think solving this challenge is the main solution to solving all of the other challenges that we're experiencing in hybrid work. So if we can build that trust and we can build that community and we can really foster that connection, whether you're remote or you're in person, I think that is the key to being more engaged as an employee, and you're having more visibility as a remote worker, and you're feeling more productive because you've got that community, you're feeling connected. So ultimately, I see this as being something that companies are working towards the most as a solution for all of the other challenges as well. So now let's talk about meaning equity. So I've kind of talked about the experience or the inequalities, I guess, between in-person and remote workers in the hybrid work world. And a term has popped up, meaning equity, that kind of represents the state of being that we're trying to achieve, to where in-person and remote workers have the same opportunities. And you might also see on this slide, I have video production rules, and you might be wondering, why the heck are these two on a slide together? They seem very different, and they could be depending on how you view it. But I'm going to talk you through how they actually have kind of a symbiotic relationship. They have this coexistence that's really beautiful, and we plan and we intend for that relationship to be very impactful as we're moving forward in the hybrid world. But first, meaning equity. So also sometimes heard of as meaning equality. I feel that the terms are interchangeable, so I might interchange between them. But in general, meaning equity is when remote and in-person workers have the same opportunities and presence during meetings, and that's ultimately leading to equal chances of success. So when I first heard the term meaning equity, my initial thought was, okay, so we want in-person and remote workers to have equal experiences. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've kind of recognized that that's not really the case, right? Because remote and in-person work is very different, and they each have their own benefits, and the experience will never be the same between those two. And I think that's kind of the beautiful thing about hybrid work, is that some people prefer the experience of remote, and some people prefer the experience of going into the office. And again, they have their beautiful differences that make them these unique work styles. So they'll never be the same experience, but what we can strive towards is that equal opportunity, those equal chances of success, regardless of what your preferred experience is. So then we've got video production rules, and video production rules in general, it's a set of techniques and used in TV and other major video productions to engage users in different ways, elicit different types of emotion, guide the focus and guide the audience's experience in different ways. So really, how are these two related? Great question. Glad you asked. So meeting equity, right? We've kind of established, or maybe I didn't establish this, but I want to establish now that I think a big part of meeting equity and a big part of solving the challenge of hybrid work, I did say this, is building that trust, building that community, building that connection between remote and in-person workers. So video production rules can help create trust or can help foster that bond. They can help guide the conversation, guide the experience, and build that community, depending on how they're used, depending on what techniques you use and what situations. So really, that's when these two sort of separate entities become a really beautiful combination and have this symbiotic relationship, because we're trying to achieve meeting equity. And we've recognized that implementing some of these video production techniques can help us achieve that meeting equity, or at least move towards it. And that's where DirectorAI comes in. This is the star of the show. This is why we're here to talk about DirectorAI. And DirectorAI is really encompasses all of our smart camera technology that you'll find on our video conferencing devices. And in general, it's designed to give you the experience that you have a professional production crew in the room with you at all times. So you've got your very own director in the room who's changing the frames, changing the shot based on what we're trying to, what we need to experience at that time to build that connection, to foster that connection, build trust, and really just have the best possible meeting that feels as close to being there as you can get. And it's created by Poly, it's created by our awesome team of scientists and engineers and artists, and then it's executed on our devices by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we've got different framing modes and techniques that, again, create those different experiences based on the situation and the nuances of the conversation. And so I mentioned, poly artists and poly scientists, and I really want to hone in on the fact that that's really what DirectorAI is. And if you think about the name DirectorAI, it kind of is in the name art and science, right? So the director is your artist. That's the video production rules. That's the, the empathy, the ethos of the experience. And then you've got the AI, and that's the science, and that's how we're executing it. But they have to work together to create the experience that we want to create. And that's built into the hardware, and that's super, super cool. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of those production rules are. I won't cover all of them, but I want to cover some of the production rules that are a bit more identifiable, and you might be able to recognize as you're watching TV, watching movies, experiencing DirectorAI, whatever it may be. So in thinking about the composition of our shots in DirectorAI, there are several different rules that we use that we've adopted from video production on TV and in movies. So I'm going to start by talking about the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is a technique that's been used in art and photography and videography for many, many years, long before I was born, long before you were born. And the basis of this technique is creating a grid on the screen or whatever your shot is, and placing things in specific locations along the grid to evoke a certain experience. And actually, fun fact, if you are on your iPhone and you go to your camera, or even just like your professional camera, a lot of times you can see that grid where you've got 9 squares, and it's because of the rule of thirds. So there's just a fun fact for you in trivia if you ever need to use that. But one of the biggest parts of rule of thirds that we use is placing the eye line of the speaker or the subject, whoever's in the main focus, placing that eye line in the top third section of the grid. And the reason for that, there are a few different reasons. Some of them are psychological, some of them are just kind of common sense, honestly. But again, a lot of different reasons, but really the main is that it's creating an experience where you can connect with the speaker or the subject even more. So for example, think about if someone's eyes are in the middle of a shot, like a bullseye, you're in the middle of the screen, your eyes are right there. What's above you? You've got wall, you've got ceiling tiles, you've got lighting fixtures, a lot of stuff that doesn't really matter to you if you're having a meeting with someone, right? You don't care that they have a chandelier above them. You don't care that they are using, whatever kind of ceiling tiles that they use. You care about them and you want to see them. So by placing their eye line up in that top third, you're getting rid of that space and putting the focus on the speaker. And then others have come to know that psychologically that third section is kind of where our eyes are naturally drawn to. So it's very easy and natural for us to look there. And plus, this is used, as I said, in video, in TV, in movies. And so again, we're really used to it. And I believe that the best products and the best experiences are the ones where we don't realize why they're so good because it's so natural to us. And that's kind of what we're doing with the rule of thirds. So another element of the rule of thirds is where, I guess, laterally you would place your subject, because in that instance, we're talking vertically, right? You're putting on the top third section, but laterally, where are we placing our subject? And the decision that we've made in a lot of our cases of our framing is to put the subject right in the center, right in the middle of the image, which seems, it seems obvious, like that would be the obvious choice, but why is that the obvious choice, right? Because a lot of times when you think of rule of thirds in photography and art, people will say that you should off-center your subject to create more interest or to create movement. But we are putting ours right in the center, which in some ways seems like breaking that rule. But there's actually a really thoughtful and strategic reason why we do this. And it's because it is easier to place focus on the subject, right? It's not as interesting and exciting, but that's not really what you want when you're trying to connect with someone, trying to have a conversation. You want to be able to focus on them. And by doing something where you can really focus, something that you're used to, something that's not different and interesting, you're able to better build trust. And again, going back to the idea of trust, building community, building that connection, that's ultimately our goal with DirectorAI. And then another element of composition that you'll see in our framing modes and within DirectorAI is the establishing shot. So if you think about a movie, the establishing shot is at the beginning of a scene, before you get into any of the action. It's a shot that shows you where the action's taking place, what's the context of what's going on, and it gives you the full picture. And I think that's a really, really important element for a meeting as well, especially when you start a meeting, because you want to know who you're talking to, who's in the room, who do you need to make sure that you're not talking bad about. I'm kidding. Hopefully none of us are talking bad about anybody, but having that context is super important. And that's why when you're switching from one of our framing modes to the next, or you're getting into a meeting, we're always going to have that establishing shot at the beginning so that we can provide that context before we move into a certain speaker or two speakers or a group, whatever the framing and whatever the shot's going to be, you have that context before you get started. And with rule of thirds, again, in some cases you're following the rules, but in some cases you're breaking them. But again, it's in a strategic way, right? So it's always thoughtful. It's always about how this change will affect the viewer's emotions and experiences. And in all of the composition and the composing that we do of our shots, that is the focus. That is what we're thinking of, is how is this going to affect the viewer? How is this going to affect the experience? So another element that we have brought into DirectorAI from TV and video production rules are transitions. And depending on what the nuances of the conversation are, how you transition from one frame or one shot to another actually becomes equally as important as how each shot is composed. So, if you can imagine a very sudden, very jarring cut in the video, just to move over to center someone who was right next to the person who was already centered, that is not a great experience. Again, it's very jarring, it's very sudden, and it just seems really unnecessary and unnatural. And on the other hand, if you're panning the camera at a very slow, very gradual pace, like a little snail across the screen, a very long room to get to the next speaker who's on the very opposite side, that's also not a great experience, because again, it's going to feel really unnatural and it's going to feel really uncomfortable to the audience as you're doing this very slow panning transition all the way across. So again, depending on the nuances of the conversation, where the active speakers are in relation to one another, our cameras are trained to determine the best course of action for making that transition. So sometimes that means easing, and easing is a slow, gradual movement. And when we ease in our transitions, we don't do it at one pace. So if you think about it in nature and in life, there are a few things that move linearly. Like most of the time, things will either be accelerating or decelerating in motion. And so when we ease, that's something that we've taken into consideration, and our eases have that change in speed. So maybe they start slow and they end fast, or maybe they start fast and they end slow, to create that experience. It's more natural. It's more what you're used to. And you probably wouldn't notice that element of that changing in speeds of an ease on our cameras, or maybe in movies or videos, because it's something that we're so used to. Why would we notice it? But it is something that I like to call out. And then, of course, there are other types of transitions, some of which I have listed here. So maybe we cut instead of easing, maybe we dissolve, maybe we fade in or out to provide a softer experience, a less jarring cut from one shot to the other. Again, this is all depending on the nuances of the conversation. Where are people sitting? What's the conversation that they're having? Is it quickly, back and forth active discussion? Is it a couple of main speakers who will have the mic for quite a while? That's all stuff that's taken into consideration, and stuff that the camera is thinking about and using to determine what to do for the transition. So I want to bring it back to DirectorAI as a whole one more time. DirectorAI being part science. And in that science, you've got the artificial intelligence, you've got the machine learning, and you've got our awesome poly engineers putting this all together, our poly scientists making this possible, right? But I don't want you to forget about the second part, which is the art. And that's what you get from the poly team. So the poly team, they are the artists. We are the artists. We are thoughtfully creating that experience. It's a device. You're interfacing with it through a device and through an app, maybe on your computer. But that experience is coming from real people who are really being thoughtful about what we want you to feel and the impact that we want to have on your experience and your success. And I think that's a really, really special part about DirectorAI, is just the passion that is put into this experience by our team. And so I'll leave you with a little video clip showing some of these transitions and this framing in action, in real life. It's not going to have everything I just mentioned, because of course this is a small subset of a conversation, but just to give everyone a little taste of what I'm talking about, I wanted to include this video for you guys. DirectorAI is our proprietary suite of smart camera technology that's designed to elevate your meeting experience and give everyone a fair shot at success. A foundational element of this technology is the ability to recognize groups of participants in a room and zoom in just enough that they're framed perfectly on screen.
On our cameras, this is called group framing, and that's what you're seeing right now. And for smaller groups having active discussions, group framing is a great option to make sure everyone is seen well by the far end at all times.
What really makes DirectorAI special is that you can switch between different camera framing modes depending on your preferences or what type of meeting you're having.
The transition that you're seeing right now is actually speaker framing mode in action. So the camera is going to identify the active speaker and move the frame over to them as they're speaking. And this is a really great option if you've got a meeting where there are a few main speakers, but not necessarily as much of an active discussion going on. Presenter tracking is a unique mode that's specifically used for presentations. So if you're giving a virtual presentation, or maybe you're delivering a virtual education lesson, the camera will follow you in real time so that you have the freedom to move into motion as you speak. Maybe you need to write on the whiteboard, or maybe you need to move across the room to show a prompt. To learn more about Poly DirectorAI and our cameras, visit poly.com.
Andie, thanks very much. That was an awesome detailed explanation of what we do and why we do it, and it's going to be built into our cameras, only improving over the years. And again, all the knowledge that I get at these conferences is pretty much a waste of time now. So that's it for this week's Poly Weekly News. Be with us next week. We're going to have the team from Wayne House Research with us. Katie Marizik and I are going to be talking to them about ISE that's coming up in another week. And then we're going to be almost live from ISE that week on a Tuesday, not a Monday. But for next week, we'll be on Monday at our normal 10 a.m. slot. And we'll see you then. For everybody at Poly, have a great week, and we'll talk to you then.